Hi, my name is Avril Z Speaks, and I am the director and showrunner for Uprooted. You ready?
No, but let's go.
Need you to take a deep breath.
In the dream, we're in the front yard and Keith is there. And he starts to slowly walk off.
He never says bye to me. He just says, I gotta go. If he would have left a note, he would have said goodbye.
My name is Sherri Warren. I had a brother named Keith, who on July 31st, 1986, was found hanging from a tree.
As soon as we got to the scene, everything just went sideways.
This case has too many red flags. It is impossible for anybody to commit suicide that way.
How in the hell do you get a young black man hanging from a tree and that not send alarm bells all the way up through the police department?
They ruled a suicide right away without any type of an investigation whatsoever.
We started asking the questions that we believed at the time the police should be asking.
This boy, he was a teenager, he had a car, he had friends, he was ready to go to college, he was getting ready to start living his life.
The story didn't make sense then, it doesn't make sense now.
For me, my motivation is somebody wanted to silence this. Somebody wanted this to go away. Nobody was investigated. Nobody was interviewed. You had no autopsy performed.
You have to look at what it was in 1986. There were racial tensions in all the suburbs.
My mom did not put her head in the sand and quietly go away.
No.
And I'm not doing it either.
Mary Cooey went to her grave trying to figure out what happened to her son.
Her life drained every year, trying to fight for justice for her child. And she couldn't get it. Not while she was here, but while I'm here, I'm gonna fight for it too.
Hello, I'm Sonia Weinstedt, and this is an episode of Filmmaker Focus. Today, we're interviewing Avril Z Speaks, director and showrunner of the docuseries Uprooted. Hi, Avril. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're so happy to have you. So I'm ready to dig into this docuseries. It was incredible. What was the initial spark for Uprooted?
So the initial spark for Uprooted was the executive producer from Now This, Matt McDonough. He originally heard about this story on a podcast and became friends with Sherri Warren, who was in the documentary. He called her up and wanted to know more information about what happened to Keith and set out on this journey to want to see this story get told. Matt approached me and said that he had a story that he thought that I might be interested in taking on. And yeah, I was taken by the story as well. I was taken by Sherri. And we just, we all just kind of began on that process of getting the story told and finding the right partners for it.
Why was it important for you to tell Keith Warren's story?
This is like a really puzzling and a really, interesting story that I feel like should have garnered some kind of media attention. And the fact that no one had heard about it, I felt like that was an injustice. And I also, just feeling a sympathy or a camaraderie, if you will, with Sherri and with her story being a Black woman. And it also centering around a Black family too. And I felt it was really important to just highlight that family story and to show Keith in a way that it has dignity, that it shows some dignity for him and for his story and to just show that his life mattered. And so that was really important to me.
I mean, really, Keith Warren's story could be many family story, right?
It could be any of us. And I think that's one of the things that drew me in, especially once we started filming and once I got to know Sherri. It's just this they're just so relatable, and they're so, they're people that you would see every day at work, at the grocery store, living next door, or even just your own family. And so there's just something very relatable about Sherri, about the Warrens, and even about Keith. Even as you get to know Keith, there's just something you kind of feel like these people. And so, yeah, it could have been anyone.
And you and executive producer Matt McDonough spent about 5 years pitching this documentary. Why do you think it took George Floyd's death in 2020 to understand that Black stories do matter?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think it's, on the one hand, it's unfortunate that it took that long for people to recognize that this story had value. One of the questions that we constantly got in the beginning of, when trying to pitch the story was the question, how is this relevant? And, how is this relevant today? Which I think is an interesting question, to say the least, because this issue of Black bodies being ignored and not being covered by the media is something that has been happening since we landed in this country. This isn't something that's new. This isn't something that just happened. So it's always been relevant. But I do think that the events of 2020 and George Floyd in particular were kind of a wake-up call to this country, that people could no longer ignore injustice in general. I think, the fact that we had been, we're already knee-deep in a pandemic, and everyone was at home. Everyone was glued to their television sets or to their phones or what have you. Everyone, the attention was kind of on our devices at that point in time. And I think that, because there was less distraction, it was kind of the for lack of a better word, the perfect storm for for an uprising, for people to say, hey, look at this, pay attention. This is what we've been saying all along. That summer, I think it just kind of got to a boiling point where people said, enough is enough. We're not going to take this anymore. And, people in terms of the industry and in terms of, studios and so on and so forth, they finally started to open their eyes to what had been being said all along. And even in the case of, Keith Warren, this story came out in the 80s, 1985, 1986. And, they've been shouting this since that time. And so I just think that just the circumstances of 2020 just help people to say, okay, what are we missing here? And what do we need to turn our eyes back toward?
And how did you determine the best approach for this documentary?
So when I spoke with Matt McDonough and we talked about what the approach could be, we knew that it was sort of going to be in this category of true crime. But we really wanted to try to give it a little bit of a social justice bent to it as well. So we tried to kind of stay away from some of the typical things that you would see in a true crime series, less recreations and things of that nature. But we also just made it a point to go deep into the family life and show Keith as a person, and to also get to know his family as well. And that was part of the reason why we took the time to go to North Carolina and interview the Warren family. They were just as much a part of this story as Sherri was, as, her mother Mary was as well. So we interviewed them and got a little bit of history about the Warren family and, how their family dynamic and how Keith fit into that dynamic.
If you talk to my mom, she will always say, we got to be there for each other. Family's got to help family. And that's how we were raised.
We're a very close family, very supportive. We fuss, we fight, or whatever else, but we were raised to always have each other's back.
When we were living in North Carolina, we grew up with a lot of family. My mom's brothers and sisters were trying to take care of us and babysit us and, be our caretakers. My aunts and uncles on my mom's side was my Uncle Pete, my Aunt Deborah, and my Uncle Ronald, my Uncle Jack.
This is 42 acres of family land. I grew up with them in the house, so I felt like an older brother. Because Keith moved in And I was probably 6 or 7 years old. And Sherri was born in this house about a year and a half later. Nieces and nephews, when they're in the house with you, they're like little brothers and sisters.
When my sister had Keith and Sherri, I would watch them, babysit, take care of them. They were that part of the family, just like my brothers and Mary were. If I had to go on a date or whatever else, who's keeping Keith and Sherri? Oh, come on, take them with us.
Having all that family around was secure, safety, comfort.
And then the other part of it was, Mary Cooey, who was Keith and Sherri's mother, who passed away in 2009. She played a big part in all of this as well. In this quest to find out the truth about what happened to her son, she kept so many meticulous notes and records, and part of how we were able to piece together, bits of the story were through her notes and her records. And so we wanted to make sure that she had a voice and that she had, a say in the documentary as well. So even that becoming part of the storytelling and how we chose to tell the narrative was to incorporate her voice by using her journal entries and using some of her writings to help narrate the story and kind of take us through the events of what happened.
A Montgomery County police officer from the Wheaton-Glenmont Police Station responded to the scene and took charge. Also, a lead homicide detective arrived. He had the body removed from the tree and sent to Collins Funeral Home in Silver Spring with instructions to have the body embalmed immediately. Even though 3 forms of identification were found in my son's pockets, it wasn't until 7 hours later that I, the next of kin, was notified of his death.
And honestly, if it wasn't for her and her notes, I don't know that we would have been able to, put everything together, because she just had so many details about, kind of like real-time events of what happens. That's a little bit of how we try to kind of take this element of true crime and to give it like a little bit of a twist and a little bit more of a personal touch, but also a sort of social justice angle to kind of speak to where we are in the times right now.
What was your first impression of Sherri Warren?
My first impression of Sherri Warren, I just thought I just felt like I knew her. She just felt like a sister, a cousin, like somebody that was in my family. And that's what I say about, them just being so relatable. She felt like a friend, a friend that I would, talk to, go out with, and, you're having that very candid conversation. And I think that that's one thing that really stood out to me in the very beginning is Sherri's candidness and also her passion.
My mother calls the police department and they said, well, yeah, I think she talked to the detective and said, we cut it down, we were collecting for evidence. Why are you collecting evidence 3 to 4 weeks after the case is closed?
And you called it a suicide.
And you called it a suicide. The motivation behind Keith's death from the Montgomery County Police Department was not to find out what happened to Keith, but to keep whatever happened to Keith hidden.
She has a lot of passion behind truth and finding out the truth and not being lied to. And I think everything comes back down to that. She's definitely a passionate woman, and she's also a truth seeker. And you can tell that from the very first conversation with her that she's a straight shooter. She's not going to hold her tongue. She's going to call things out and call them as she sees them, which I think was really needed for this documentary, and definitely for such a time as this. I think this was the right time for a voice like Sherri. So it was refreshing to have that conversation, that very first conversation with her, and just realize that this was going to be the voice of this series moving forward.
Can you talk about some of the people you interviewed and why they were integral to the story?
Yeah, so we tried to make it a point to interview both people who knew the family well and also people who were sort of outside of the situation because we didn't want it to feel, too biased in one direction. I think, one of the, comments that had been, given to the family many times over throughout the years was that, oh, they just can't get over Keith's death. And so we wanted to make sure to have voices that could refute that and have people who were not part of the family, not even part of the case at all, to be able to weigh in and talk about what they saw that was unjust about what happened to Keith. And so with that said, we interviewed Rodney Kendall, who was a friend of the family and also lived in the Georgian colonies where Mary and Sherri and Keith lived in Silver Spring, Maryland. And Rodney was important because he was the first person to identify Keith's body when he was found in the woods. Someone came and got him at the clubhouse where he worked.
I was the person that was asked to identify a body hanging in the tree in the Georgian colonies. I was a military police officer. I've seen people get hit by a train. I've seen downed helicopters. And that's right up there. I knew him. This isn't just, me coming on the scene and it's a stranger. I knew him. That could be you. That could be me.
And, it was interesting because for Rodney to have been on the scene, he was never questioned. And, so that being sort of, yet another one of those red flags. We interviewed Dallas Lip, who was also on the scene. He was the EMT who was the first to arrive on the scene and, was able to give an account of what he saw that day and also what has been, sort of taunting him since that day. When you experience something like that, you can't help but to relive it. And, he's a person that has, just been very forthcoming about what he saw when he arrived in the woods that day. Everything from the house that made the initial 911 call to the actual scene itself where Keith's body was found.
Something happened to Keith and he died. He died in a location and at a time that was inconvenient for somebody, and then they tried to separate themselves by staging a suicide, but actually what they staged was a lynching.
And then we also interviewed the journalist Del Walters, who was integral to sort of bringing the story forward 6 years of when after the photographs of Keith's body hanging were found and left on the doorstep of Mary Cooey. And Del Walters found those photos, and he was the one that said, hey, we need to look at this. And that was actually one of the first records of any type of media attention that this case even got. If you go back to 1986, you don't see, there's no records of what happened to Keith. There's no articles, no news stories, anything like that. You won't find them. But you do find information from Del Walters in 1992 when they found those photos. And he really tried to bring this story into the forefront, seeing that this was a story that was happening right in the shadows of the nation's capital.
For 6 years, everyone from the FBI to the Montgomery County Police to the county executive thought Mary Cooey was a grieving mother who couldn't face the fact that her son committed suicide. And for 6 years, she maintained they were all wrong. Then last spring, in what was either a cruel joke or a strong message to Mary Cooey to keep up her protest, pictures of her son's hanging were left on her doorstep.
To that point of bringing in people who had nothing to do with the case and, but were able to kind of speak to what went wrong. We interviewed Dr. Roger Mitchell, who was a former medical examiner for Washington, D.C., and he was able to spell out what should be the protocols for medical examiners when they come and do a death investigation. And for him to point out, just the gravity of what went wrong in Keith's case, the fact that there was no autopsy performed and how that, can greatly damage getting to the bottom of what happened. It's a great disservice to Keith, and it's a great disservice to the family. On that same note, we also interviewed Joe Alertia, who was a private investigator on the case as well. And then we also interviewed the chief of police, the Montgomery County chief of police, because, we wanted them to be able to speak for themselves on why this case was handled so poorly. And so to be able to have that voice and hear straight from his mouth of what he felt, why they didn't do what they were supposed to do. And so, we tried to give people a voice and a chance to say from their perspective what they felt. And again, it was just really important for us to have all those voices represented because we wanted to show the full story of what happened and, more importantly, what didn't happen in Keith's case.
Del Waters believes, said from the beginning that he believes that the police botched the case from the beginning. I mean, do you think that's why the police continue to stonewall the Warrens?
Yeah, I think that, what's interesting is that, the police department have said to the Warren family that this case was not conducted properly. They just won't say it publicly. So I think that the police department knows that that it was botched, that it was not handled the way it should have been handled. Why they won't come out and give a public apology, I don't know. It's kind of like opening up Pandora's box, because for every Keith Warren, there's probably hundreds more, maybe even thousands more families who have, gone through similar or the same exact thing that the Warren family has gone through. During the course of making this documentary, and even before that, we've discovered other families who have had, even families in the state of Maryland, who have been gaslighted and who have, had, these injustices happen and have unanswered questions to the death of a loved one, and only to be stonewalled by the police. So I think if the police were to acknowledge any wrongdoing or acknowledge any kind of, mishandling on their part, they're going to have to do the same thing for these other families who are requesting the same thing. I don't think that they want to go there. But, I think Sherri says in the documentary, if they think that she's just going to go away, they got another thing coming. So they might want to open up.
You touched on this, but 6 years after Keith's death, Mary received an anonymous package that contained copies of 5 crime scene photos classified to the Montgomery County Police. Who do you think sent them and why?
I think that it may have been someone inside the department who knew something was amiss and was trying to warn Mary to keep going in her fight and to not give up. I don't think at any point Mary Cooey was about to give up trying to find out what happened. But I do imagine that it probably wears on you after a while when you keep, saying that we need to look at this, something is wrong here, and you keep getting a door slammed in your face. And that's exactly what those photos did. Those photos reignited the charge. It helped Mary. It gave her the ammunition that she needed in order to keep fighting, to keep pressing, to keep looking, to keep asking questions. And not only that, but I think that through those photos, her team also grew in terms of the people that were supporting her and helping her to try to find some answers. And so you had people like Del Walters, you had people like Joe Alertia, you had people like the Clams, which was a justice organization in Silver Spring. You had all of these people that came together to help her. And they were the ones that helped her raise the money to exhume the body so that they could conduct their own private autopsy, because that wasn't done 6 years ago.
How did the inconsistencies between what the police told the Warren family at the time and what was in the photos convince them that Keith did not commit suicide?
One of the main ones was his clothing. His clothing that he had on in the pictures were not the clothing that they got back from the police on the night that he died. His shoes, anyone who knew Keith knew that Keith always walked around in a pair of brown Timberlands, and he wore those all the time. And in the picture, and in those photos, he had on a pair of white tennis shoes, which the family is like, he didn't even own a pair of tennis shoes. So whose shoes were those? The fact that he wasn't even hanging, his feet were on the ground. It was almost like he was sitting at a bar stool or something. There was a person standing in the background of those photos. You know, who was this person, and why are they allowed to just stand in the background of a crime scene and not be questioned?
When you look at the photos, it's impossible to even think that that was a suicide because he's dangling from a rope. Everything about that is wrong.
It proved our point. Just the positioning of the body, you can see there's no way. He's strung up, he's not hanging down. The clothing, that's not what we got back in 1986.
The police had given them the rope, the shoes, and the clothing, and said this is what he was wearing. It was not the same clothing or shoes, for that matter, that were in the pictures on his body.
If nothing else, they should have warranted a second look at the case. And, you know, the family at this point is pretty much just asking for the death certificate to be changed from suicide to undetermined. And I think that those photos should have been, some proof to say we need to at least rethink, whether or not this was a suicide, because those elements were just not adding up.
An autopsy is one of the most important elements of any death investigation. Can you talk about how a lack of one changed the trajectory of this entire case?
Joe Alertia says it best in the series. He says that he says something along the lines of trying to do a death investigation with no autopsy is like putting someone in a plane and with no instructions and saying, okay, now fly. And, that was the big disservice in this case, is that, even to this day, we still don't know what happened to Keith Warren because we have no autopsy. We have no evidence. We have nothing to reference. We have nothing to go back on. And, even at the time of death, the fact that, they had the body embalmed without even getting family permission, it really hindered the movement of this case altogether because there was nothing you could do at that point. The medical examiner said, just put it down as a suicide. And, the fact that there was no investigation and no autopsy is so crippling for this case. And this is why they say they just want the death certificate changed and just want an apology, because you can't even really do an investigation at this point.
Years later, we're still having a conversation about what is unknown about Mr. Warren's case. Now, there still may have been a lot unknown about his case, but the one thing that would have been known would have been the findings at autopsy, had there been one.
They exhumed the body and did their own private autopsy, which that autopsy did reveal that there may have been some foul play. So even for that to not be enough for the police department to reopen the case, or, to take a look at this case again and just re-examine that death certificate, it's highly troubling that couldn't even be enough for you to say, hey, let's take a look at this.
When Chief Jones said to me last year, there's nothing to show me anything other than suicide. No, I have to say this. That was a punch in the gut for me. It takes the air out of you. It takes the wind out of you, but then you have to find that part of yourself that knows what it is and the truth, right? And you have to suck it back up and continue on, because that's not your truth. That's not the reality, and we still got work to do.
Now they don't have justice in the very beginning in the fact that there is no autopsy. And then they have an autopsy that suggests something different from what was reported, and they won't look at that either. I mean, that's injustice on both ends.
So Mary never gave up trying to solve her son's case, and after her death, Sherri continued her work. Can you talk about the two very different approaches mother and daughter took in dealing with authorities in trying to solve this case?
I think Del Walters said it best in the docuseries when he said, Mary Cooey is Rosa Parks, Sherri Warren is Angela Davis. And that's a great, analogy and a great way to describe the two of them. I think Mary Cooey, she tried the approach of playing nice, playing by the rules, and playing fair. And I think Mary expected the system to play fair, that if I'm nice to them, they'll be nice to me, and eventually I'll get what I want. And as we can see 36 years later, that's not the case, because we still don't have answers to what happened to Keith.
She's a Black female in a white county with two kids, one now. And she's looking for justice for her Black son hanging from a tree in a white county. She's had to talk to white men who didn't want to hear her voice. So she felt like she had to put this face on, this nice Black face that wouldn't be so insulting or rude. And she didn't want to turn people off. She wanted to bring them in. She thought she had to be presented in a way that was accepting to everyone and to be well received, I guess. Use the right words, look, attitude, energy. But that's just not me.
This is the time for calling things out as they are and as we see them. And so it's the perfect time for Sherri to use her voice in the way that is natural to her. And this is how she's doing it. And this is what she's doing every day. She's still fighting this fight every day. I've seen her talk to her. She's still calling out Montgomery County Police and holding them accountable. And I think that, again, that's where I think a lot of where we are in this, time of history is holding people accountable. And I think, that's a big difference between Sherri and her mother is, and I would even venture to say this generation is calling people to the carpet and holding them accountable for the words that they say and holding those up against the actions that they do. You can say, we're trying to build a better police force. You can say that all day, but where's the action behind that? And I think that's what Sherri's trying to do, is she's trying to hold them accountable and hold them to the carpet on what they're saying.
In 2003, Mary sent a petition to then medical examiner David Fowler for an amendment to Keith's death certificate, but it was never acknowledged. Can you talk about why David Fowler is significant, to what's currently happening, as well as, former Montgomery Police Chief Tom Manger?
So, yeah, we talked earlier about, why this story sort of came back around and why people showed an interest in it now. I think that there were several events that happened in 2020 and in 2021 that kind of brought this story back around full circle. Some of the names that have been a part of this story for several years came up in the news, some largely around George Floyd, David Fowler being one of those names. So David Fowler testified on behalf of Chauvin, defending his actions in the death of George Floyd. And come to find out, David Fowler was actually the medical examiner in 2003 when Mary Cooey petitioned to have Keith's death certificate changed after a grand jury convened and determined Keith's cause of death as inconclusive. And so that should have been enough right there to be able to take to the medical examiner to get the death certificate changed. And she petitioned David Fowler for that change, and it was never acknowledged. Why it was never acknowledged? I don't know, but he was the name that was on the petition, and that, that petition went to his office. And so, to see his name come back around again in the Chauvin trial, it was full circle. And then also to discover that under his tenure as medical examiner of Maryland, there were several other cases as well under his jurisdiction that had wrongful determinations. So, his name came back around. And then also, Chief Tom Manger, who is currently right after the January 6th insurrection, was named the chief of Capitol Police. Several years ago, when the Warren family went to the police department to petition, re-examining Keith's case, and Chief Major was one of those people that said to the Warren family, this case has been mishandled, grossly mishandled by our department. But yet he won't say that publicly. So the Warren family had several meetings with Chief Major during his tenure as chief of police of Montgomery County. They had several conversations with him. There's several emails that were exchanged between Major and the Warren family, but yet still no apology. And so for his name to come back up again, and now, he's heralded as this, new chief of Capitol Police, it still points back to that constant, circle that the Warren family keeps going in. As, these people keep getting elevated and they're in the news, while the Warren family is still just trying to find answers. They're still trying to get a piece of paper changed, and they get to go on with their lives.
Mary said in 1986, my issue is not your issue today, but continue to ignore my issue, and my issue will one day become your issue. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a profound statement by Mary Cooey, and it's actually a quote. We referenced this in the series. It's a sentiment that has been expressed many times over, especially by loved ones who were left behind. That you can continue to carry on with your life as if this doesn't affect you and as it doesn't matter. And and I feel like oftentimes law enforcement and these politicians and officials, that's what seems to happen, is there's this, it's not my problem, I'm just going to keep on going. And I think for Mary, she was saying at that time, you can keep ignoring it if you want to, but at some point, this is gonna erupt. And you keep saying, oh, that's just her, that's her issue, she just needs to get over it. But at some point, that being her issue is going to become everybody's issue. And I think that that's the place where we are right now. I think that's what George Floyd brought about, was that this isn't just a Black thing. This is America. This is what everybody has to deal with. And, you can turn a blind eye all you want, but at some point, the truth is going to have to come to light. And at some point, we're all going to have to face it. And I think that's what Mary Cooey was trying to say with that quote. And it's a very timely quote for where we are today.
Can you describe a moment in the film that you found particularly disturbing or moving? And what was it about that scene that was especially compelling for you?
I think one moment that felt compelling and moving was there's a little piece, I think it's in episode 2, when Keith's body is exhumed, and there's a shot of Mary Cooey just kind of off to the side crying. And I cried when I saw it in the edit, just because no mother should have to go through that. First of all, to have to bury your son in the first place of such a horrendous death, such a horrendous way for him to be found, to have to do that once and then have to pull him back up because the police and law enforcement won't do their job, and then to have to bury him again, just the idea of that was really heartbreaking. And then I think, what was disturbing to me was, just in the doc and throughout the course of filming, the fact that Keith's friends would not speak to us. It was really heartbreaking. I mean, when I imagine the people that I come in contact with every day and call my friends, it breaks my heart to think that if something terrible were to happen to me, that none of them would stand up and, say a good word. We got to a point where we just needed someone to get on camera and just say, Keith was a nice guy. And, we couldn't even really find anybody to do that.
I find it difficult. And I find it amazing why the friends don't want to talk now. Why they don't want to talk on camera or talk to anybody at this point. It's extremely odd to me. Were they threatened?
We were able to get someone to talk, just their voice, which we had to disguise. But, just to have someone come on camera and say he was a nice guy that I hung out with and we went out for ice cream after school. Like, we couldn't even get someone to say that. They would tell us that on the phone, but they wouldn't say it on camera. Sherri talks about it in the series that these people were always at her house, always eating her food, watching television. And somebody had to know what happened, or at least know where he was, or at least know where he was going. And the fact that no one will speak I think that that's one of the things that just really hurt my heart. It was really discouraging that no one would take that on. Another thing that was surprising and disturbing that we learned during filming was when Mary Cooey passed away, the officers celebrated. And I just thought that was really sick. I mean, it made me sick when I heard it, like physically sick.
Just another little topic. I was told that when Mary, Keith Warren's mom, died, they had a little celebration at the police department and the homicide office. That's about it was. That really boiled my blood because she was doing the right thing for her son, and she was a thorn on the police department. But when they find out that she died, they kind of a little celebration about that. Oh, we finally got rid of her. Yeah, they actually had a drink and kind of cheer. Hey, case is over. Die.
It just speaks to the level of disrespect and the level of just dismissal of Mary Cooey, this mother who is grieving, and the fact that, that they would see her persistence as being a nuisance or as being, a distraction for them is very disturbing. That is the department that this family has been experiencing, a department that would celebrate someone's death, someone who is really just a mother trying to find out what happened to her son.
What do you think motivates Sherri to keep going after 3 decades?
That's a good question. I think what keeps Sherri motivated is she really is a truth seeker. I think that what motivates her is the fact that there's still been no movement, and she's determined to get to the bottom of what happened, or even just to have acknowledgement. And, I think that Sherri really has a concern for people and not wanting to see other people go through what her family has gone through for the past 36 years. She's very active and very vocal in that sense of getting people out to vote, and also getting people to challenge their local officials when they see something that's not right, to challenge it, to ask questions, and to not be afraid to call it out. So I think all of those things is what motivates her to keep going and to keep fighting to find truth and to find justice, not just for herself and for her family, but for other families as well.
What needs to happen for Sherri and her family to feel like they've received justice?
I think for Sherri and the family, they need acknowledgement that their handling of this entire case was not right. That in and of itself was not just. And I think that is the beginning of what the family is looking for, just an acknowledgement. But really, at the end of the day, I just think that they, it's very dismissive for an entire department for 36 years to act like you don't exist. To act like you don't exist, to act like a death, a loss of a loved one doesn't matter.
Justice is acknowledgement of Keith's death not being a suicide. Acknowledgement is reclassifying the case and changing the death certificate from anything other than suicide. Acknowledgement is the letter of apology to my mother for what they put her through. Acknowledgement that the system was broken. Acknowledgement that this will not happen to somebody else's family. That's justice for me.
That's very demeaning and demoralizing. And I think that if they would just acknowledge the dismissal that they've had of this family for all of these years, I think that that would go a long way with Sherri and with the Warren family. And to do that publicly, not behind closed doors, but to publicly acknowledge that that this was mishandled, I think it would go a long way.
What do you want audiences to take away from Uprooted?
What I want audiences to take away from Uprooted is that Keith mattered. Keith's life mattered. He was a person. He was a son. He was a brother. He was a nephew. He had a whole life ahead of him, and that was taken away. And that shouldn't be something that's taken lightly. And I want people to take away that he deserves justice. I want it to be taken away that he deserves better. His life deserved better than what he got. And I also want people to take away that they have a voice, that you can question, if you see something that doesn't feel right, that doesn't sound right, it's okay to ask questions, to knock on those doors, to not take everything at face value. And, you can be the nuisance, or what they'll call a nuisance, but that's just doing your diligence as a family member, as a citizen. As a citizen, we all have the right and we all have the duty to look after one another in that way, and to demand that these types of things don't happen again, but also that they're treated properly and get the attention that they deserve. So, hopefully when people watch this series, it empowers them to take action, to want to call up their local officials and ask questions of what happened. I hope when people watch this that, they'll, want to contact the Montgomery County Police and ask questions about what really happened. What are you doing to help the Warren family? What are you doing to help them bring closure to this matter? That's my hope, is that that people will feel empowered in that way to get active and to take charge until we see change.
What impact has the series had since its release? I mean, has there been any movement in the case?
We're still getting blanks, silence from Montgomery County Police Department. One thing that has happened since the case is that we have gotten more stories, fortunately and unfortunately. At least these, people are starting to feel like they have a voice and also have someone, that they can share with, that say, oh, that happened to them too. It's not just us. They feel a sense of solidarity, in a sense that, we're fighting in this together. So, that is something that has happened since the documentary, and hopefully it will continue. Hopefully more people will come forward, but ultimately, hopefully these families will start to be able to find some closure.
What did you learn from your experience making this film?
I would just reiterate, I would say again, I think I really learned just the importance of, local government and the importance of paying attention and getting involved, because those are the people that are making those everyday decisions about who's going to jail. They make those decisions about who is the, chief of police, about, who's governing your city, and those type of decisions are what affect what happened to people like Keith Warren. And I also think that, just in terms of the project and our process, I think I also, my other takeaway is just how important, community and teamwork is to the process. We had a fantastic team, behind the camera, also at the network as well, who were just really all on the same page and, wanted to tell the same story and wanted to really see the Warren family and Keith portrayed with dignity. And we were all on that same page, and we all kind of went forward with that common goal. And I think it reflected not just in the work in terms of the product, but also in terms of in the process as well. I think we all kind of became, a bit of a family. And I think that, that's a process that I hope can be replicated through other work that I do and that other people do as well, because I think it does affect the outcome in terms of, the overall effect of the series. So, and the story. So, hopefully we can do that again.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Avril. I think this is a really important, docuseries, and I'm so glad that, that you discovered the case of, the story of Keith Warren, and you brought it to light. And I hope everyone tunes in and watches it, because, I think it's something that we all need to learn from. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.